Northern Lights, the stories of Minnesota's past. Chapter 9, Minnesota's Civil War. Even as the Civil War was splitting the nation in two, another struggle was threatening the lives and futures of many Minnesotans. This one pitted Minnesota's oldest residents, the Dakota, against its newest residents, the white settlers. By the early 1860s, the Dakota's traditional homelands were rapidly filling up with farms and small towns. The 1851 treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, and another treaty in 1858, had left the Dakota just a 10-mile wide strip of land along the southern side of the Minnesota River, and a promise of an annual payment called an annuity. But even there, the Dakota could not feel secure. White settlers were taking over land where the Dakota still hunted game and gathered food. Other white people lived and worked among the Dakota, trying to convince them to give up their traditional ways. Food supplies were short, and many Dakota were starving. The annuities due from the government were late. Tensions were rising. All that was needed was a spark for disaster to strike. In the summer of 1862, the spark came. It ignited one of the bloodiest episodes in Minnesota's history. Page 124. Setting the stage at the Lower Sioux Agency. The Dakota's narrow strip of land among the Minnesota River was split into two reservations, each with its own government field office or agency. The Upper Sioux Agency was close to the junction of the Minnesota and Yellow Medicine Rivers. The Lower Sioux Agency was near the junction of the Minnesota and Redwood Rivers. By 1862, both agencies had grown into small towns. The towns at the Lower Sioux Agency was an especially busy place with homes, mills, warehouses, stores, a stable, a steamboat landing, and a schoolhouse. The people who lived at the Lower Sioux Agency and on the reservation surrounding it represented cultures and viewpoints whose differences eventually led to a tragic confrontation. Government personnel. In 1862, the top government official at the Upper and Lower Sioux Agencies was the agent Thomas Galbraith. He was the person responsible for carrying out the U.S. government policy regarding the reservations, which was designed to make the Dakota reject their culture and accept white culture. Among other things, the agent distributed the annuities of food and money that the U.S. government had promised the Dakota under the treaties of 1851 and 1858. The agent also oversaw a host of government workers, including blacksmiths, carpenters, and a doctor. Many of these people lived and worked in a cluster of buildings surrounding the agency headquarters. Traders. The government allowed a small group of traders, including the unpopular Andrew Myrick, to run stores where the Dakota could get additional food and supplies. The stores were located on the agency's west side. The traders usually worked on a credit system. They provided goods to the Dakota with the understanding that the Dakota would pay their debts when they received their annuities. The traders kept written records of every business deal they made. The Dakota did not. As a result, dishonest traders were able to cheat the Dakota by claiming debts that the Dakota did not actually owe. Missionaries. By 1862, two missionaries, Samuel Hinman and John Williamson, had each founded churches just east of the Lower Sioux Agency. Their main goal was to convince the Dakota to give up their own spiritual traditions and accept Christianity. The U.S. government's policies toward the Dakota supported this goal because government officials believed that Dakota who accepted white Christian spiritual beliefs were more likely to accept other parts of white culture as well. The missionaries lived among the Dakota, got to know many of them well, and often spoke up for the Dakota when they had disagreements with the traders and the agent. Traditional Dakota. In the summer of 1862, many Dakota on the lower reservation lived in teepees and bark lodge villages along the south side of the Minnesota River. Each village was led by a respected leader, such as Teo Ye Teuta, or Little Crow, Makoto, or Blue Earth, and Wapahasha, or Red Banner. Families in these villages wanted to continue their traditional ways of life. They kept their sacred rituals and beliefs despite the missionaries' efforts to convert them to Christianity. These traditional Dakota often moved off the reservations to hunt game and gather food, despite the government's attempts to turn them into full-time farmers. Farm Dakota. By 1862, several hundred Dakota on the lower reservation were living on farms. They grew crops, raised livestock, and lived in wood or brick houses along the main road that cut through the reservation. Most of them, including the Dakota leader Teope, or Wounded Man, abandoned traditional Dakota customs and adapted to the white people's way of life. These farm Dakota were expected to wear white people's clothing and attend the missionaries' churches. The men were pressured to cut their hair short like the white men on the reservation. Tensions rise. A main source of tension on the reservation was the combined effort of the government and the missionaries to remake Dakota culture. The whites were always trying to make the Indians give up their life and live like white men, recalled the traditional Dakota leader Wanbu Ditanka, or Big Eagle. The Indians wanted to live as they did before. If the Indians had tried to make the whites live like them, the whites would have resisted, and it was the same way with many Indians. As more and more Dakota accepted the whites' ways, tensions rose among the Dakota themselves. Traditional Dakota looked down on farm Dakota for abandoning their heritage. Many of the traditional Dakota were also angry because the government gave extra food as well as tools and livestock to the farm Dakota. For their part, the farm Dakota believed that they were doing what was best for their futures. They resented the way the traditional Dakota treated them. Another source of tension was the relationship between the Dakota and the government. Under the treaties of 1851 and 1858, government personnel were supposed to make regular distributions of money, food, and supplies to the Dakota. In a short time, the Dakota became dependent on the distributions, but often those annuities were late and smaller than the Dakota expected. The Dakota's relationship with the traders was equally strained. The credit system, with its many opportunities for trader cheating, had always been a big part of the problem. But in the summer of 1862, traders shut down the entire credit system. They refused to extend any more credit because annuity payments were late. They were worried that without the annuities, the Dakota would be unable to pay off their debts. When a group of Dakota leaders from the lower reservation asked the traders to reopen their stores, the traders refused. From that time, the Indians and the traders were unfriendly, recalled the Dakota woman named Wechank Piwashtewi, or Good Star Woman.